Director challenges a regular woman to fix an impossible engine. What she shows! She stepped onto the stage like someone who'd wandered onto the wrong set. Worn jeans, a no-name sweater, her hair tied back in a makeshift bun. No credentials on a badge. Actually, no badge at all. Just a screwdriver in her hand and a story in her eyes. Someone who had nothing left to lose. The Aeronova Technologies auditorium looked like a courtroom. Executives in Italian suits, award-winning engineers, reporters with phones held high. Center stage, like a jewel teetering on the edge of failure, sat the MX900, the company's most expensive experimental engine and the most problematic. For days, it had failed in complete silence, overheating, instability, nobody knew why, and then she showed up. The CEO, Bruno Castellani, was the first to laugh out loud. Microphone in hand, his voice practiced to sound friendly, even when he was being cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pointing at Lucia, as if introducing a joke, "this is the candidate who believes she can solve what our elite engineers couldn't. No degree, no resume, just guts. Let's see." The laughter was immediate. Some sneers, others nervous giggles. An engineer leaned over to whisper to a colleague, "She knows this isn't a bike shop, right?" But she didn't respond, didn't even look at them. She simply walked toward the engine. Gradually, the laughter faded into silence. With firm, almost choreographed movements, Lucia opened the MX900 side panel. The room tensed. One mistake, and the engine could blow, or even worse, prove she was exactly what they claimed, an clueless intruder. But she didn't hesitate. She removed parts with precision, checked pressures, reconnected circuits with manual adjustments. No one in that room would dare try without running 3 simulations first. Castellani folded his arms. Discomfort began to ripple through the front rows. And then, the sound. The MX900 came to life. For the first time, the engine stabilized. No surges, no hiccups, running exactly as it should have from the start. The monitor blinked green. Everyone saw it. Absolute silence, until she spoke, not shouting, not gloating, just, she said, "This project was born from my hands, and it was stolen." The impact was instantaneous. No one laughed now. Lucia pulled documents from her bag. Original schematics, records dated before the official development of the MX900. A timeline that could only have come from inside. "I came here because I saw the danger," she continued, "and because I'm tired of being erased from my own story." A reporter tried to ask a question, but her voice caught in her throat. One of the engineers simply lowered his eyes. "I don't want money," she said. "I don't want a position. I just came to make sure this machine doesn't kill anyone. Because when technology is driven by vanity, it fails. And when it fails, it costs lives." She glanced at Castellani. "I don't have an MBA. I have a scar." She grabbed her bag, the screwdriver still in her hand, turned around, walked off the stage. Outside, the sky was overcast, but she breathed as if after years she felt the air fill her lungs again. Inside, no one knew what to say. No press release was issued. No jokes about mechanics were made that day. Because sometimes the brightest mind is the one the whole world refused to see, and now it was too late to pretend she didn't exist. 5 years earlier, it was summer at the Helios Scorpion Space Center, and the name Lucia Almeida was starting to circulate the halls as a synonym for revolution. She was 31 years old and had a future that nobody could predict. Only respect. She led the advanced propulsion team. She presented ideas that sounded like science fiction, but became code, solder, ignition. And always by her side was Diego Ferraz, engineer, project partner, fiancé. They seemed unbeatable. They laughed in the lab late into the night, improvised dinners among cables and spreadsheets. They were 2 steps away from filing a patent that could change the course of space exploration, a new resonant combustion engine with self-adaptive control. Lucia called it the Child of Silence, because it ran without noise, almost imperceptible. On the eve of the official presentation, Lucia left her cell phone in the lab. She went back alone at midnight, the hallways empty and the building in nighttime mode. That's when she saw the light on in the data security room. And inside, Diego, copying files from the confidential server to an external drive. For seconds, she didn't understand. Then she refused to. "What are you doing?" she asked, frozen in the doorway. Diego turned with a poorly disguised start. He tried to smile. Shut the laptop. I was just organizing backups for tomorrow's pitch." She glanced at the time on the screen, the file names, the password typed seconds before. "That's not a backup, Diego. It's a total transfer, including encrypted access logs." He lowered his head, but only for a second. When he looked at her again, his face was different, cold, calm. "Listen, Lucia. You don't understand what's at stake. I made contacts. This will change our lives. We can sell before filing. There are already interested parties, big players." "Sell? This is our work, our blood. You're talking about betraying everything we built." He took a deep breath. "No, I'm talking about finally being recognized. About stopping being your sidekick, because that's what I am here. Lucia's partner. Never the creator, never the leader. Only you shine. And I'm tired of it." She shook her head. Her voice faltered. You're sabotaging me." He moved closer. "I'm freeing myself." And then came the final blow. The next day, the lab exploded. "A security incident," they said. Lucia was inside. She survived by a hair, a wounded arm, a neck trauma, mild burns. While she was still recovering, she learned from the press that she was being suspended. The company claimed human error on her part. Diego had presented evidence, photos, logs, an edited statement. She tried to defend herself, but no one listened. Her badge was deactivated, her name removed from the teams, emails archived, and, little by little, erased. Friends fell silent. Partners vanished. Her reputation became ruin. And Diego? He was promoted. He gained prominence. He presented a new version of the project months later, under a new name, MX-900. The world believed him, and Lucia disappeared. No one ever mentioned her name again. After the scandal, Lucia vanished from social media, from the industry, from all contacts. Helios wiped her from their records with the same efficiency they used to decommission satellites. She, who once graced the covers of scientific magazines, now took buses with grease on her hands and hollow eyes from seeing what she never wanted to. She rented a warehouse on the outskirts of an industrial city, a peripheral neighborhood where cracked asphalt was the least of the problems. There she became another nobody, technician, community workshop, no badge, no uniform, no last name. The place had no structure, but it had people. Curious youngsters, frustrated mechanics, girls who heard more "this isn't for you" than genuine advice. Lucia listened to them. She fixed bicycles, reconditioned old engines, refurbished parts nobody thought could be useful anymore. But what she did most was observe. She studied quietly, learned new technologies on the margins. With second-hand parts, she recreated ignition systems that top engineers wouldn't even consider testing. She didn't talk about the past. She just taught. With every screw, every explanation of talk, she passed on something beyond technique, a sense of dignity. For 5 years she lived like that, invisible to the corporate world, essential to a small group of young people who, with her, relearned how to believe in themselves. Until one ordinary afternoon, something changed. The sound of a report on an old tube TV caught her attention, a program about aerospace innovation. The screen showed the Aeronova Technologies Hall. At the center, the new MX-900 engine, with Diego Ferraz in the front row, applauding like the father of a creation. The camera zoomed in on the technical readout. Lucia froze. She recognized the flaw. A deviation in the resonance filter, small but deadly under pressure. The same one she had corrected before the lab explosion, the same one she identified in the original prototype. And then, something she'd spent years trying to bury came back with force. It wasn't anger, not pain. It was urgency. She knew, if that went into operation as it was, lives would be at risk. And this time, she couldn't pretend she didn't see it. But how to denounce it? Who would listen? She had no badge, no company, no allies. She only had knowledge and the truth. And for her, that was enough. In the following days, she revisited old notes, evidence saved on forgotten drives, dated records, everything she'd managed to salvage before being cut out. She connected the dots, rebuilt what was destroyed. She knew what to do, and then she signed up for Aeronova's public event, a marketing initiative called Open Challenge, open to any citizen bold enough to try to fix the MX-900, which had been failing tests for days. She didn't use her last name. She only wrote Lucia, independent technician, Santa Clara workshop. She could have ignored it. No one knew that the engine flaw could kill. No one except her. She could have stayed in the workshop, taught her crew, gone back to being invisible. But invisibility doesn't protect the innocent, and cowardice disguised as peace never saved anyone. Lucia knew too much, so when she got the confirmation that her entry had been accepted for the MX-900 challenge, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: real fear. The kind of fear that doesn't scream, just tightens your chest from the inside out. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in front of the old workbench in her shop, her grease-stained fingers shaking over an old project. She picked up the screwdriver, looked at it as if it were a weapon or a promise. That was all she had. The next morning, she walked to the bus stop carrying the same backpack as always. Inside, technical evidence, an encrypted drive, and a small bottle of water. Her hands bore old burn scars. Her fingers were calloused. The scar on her arm, hidden from others, burned just thinking about going back. Her spine ached as usual, but that day, she walked tall, because it wasn't her body holding her up. It was her decision. On the ride over, memories flashed. The moment she was accused with no chance to defend herself. The sound of the lab exploding, Diego denying everything, those calm eyes that already knew he'd win. The HR office, the cold layoff, the pitying looks, the silence. Every bus stop was a reminder, you don't belong to this world anymore. But it was a lie. This was hers from the start. She arrived at the Aeronova building. There was no fuss at reception, no security guards blocking her. The event was open. All it took was an ID and a waiver. No one glanced twice at her name. She walked in. The hall was bigger than she remembered, but the faces were the same. The same ones who once applauded Diego, the same ones who believed without question. Deep down, the same blind faith in the most expensive badge. Then they called her name, just her first. Lucia, no last name, no history. Some snickered, others furrowed their brows, but she climbed onto the stage, silent, screwdriver in hand. In the audience, someone whispered, "Is this for real?" The host hesitated, but he stuck to the script. "The candidate has 20 minutes to present her intervention. Good luck." Lucia didn't respond. Didn't even say thank you. She knelt before the engine, touched the panel like greeting an old friend, closed her eyes for 2 seconds, inhaled, and began. First, she analyzed the resonance. Then, the pressure filters. Every move was swift, precise, like she wasn't just fixing a flaw, but unearthing something that had been stolen. In the audience, the laughter stopped. Phones went up. The whispers turned to silence. And Lucia got to work. Not for the prize, not for the ego, but for something bigger. She wanted everything to go right, and to go right the right way, because she wasn't there to prove she knew more than they did. She was there to stop a mistake, disguised as innovation, from killing someone. 20 minutes later, the engine responded. Silent, stable, perfect, and everything she still needed to do was yet to come. She stepped off the stage. The sound of the MX-900 running flawlessly still hummed in the background, but the buzz was already growing. Technicians whispering, an executive talking about an urgent audit, a reporter filming stories, saying some unknown woman just fixed a multi-million-dollar engine live. But none of that mattered to her, because in the back of the room, he was there, leaning against one of the marble columns, tie loosened, expression unreadable. Diego Ferraz. Their eyes met. He was the first to move. He walked toward her with measured steps, not fast, not slow, as if to show he was still in control. "You showed up," he said quietly, like a compliment. Lucia held his gaze. "And you didn't disappear. I didn't think you'd have the nerve," he continued, forcing a half-smile. "I thought you'd accepted your place." "I accepted it," she replied, "and now I understand it's not behind you, not behind anyone." Diego glanced around to check if anyone was paying attention. Then, in a whisper, "You're not going to get anything out of this. No one wants to relive the past. You fixed the engine. Congrats. You'll walk away with some credibility. Don't ruin it." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small silver drive. "This contains all the original development logs, signed, dated, from before the MX-900 even existed." He froze for a second. She went on, "And it also has the failure reports you ignored. The same one that almost killed me. The same one that's in the engine now. The difference is, I fixed it, and you hid it. You're not going to do this, Lucia. I already did." She turned away, but before taking 2 steps, she stopped. "You know what else is on this drive? A recording of this conversation. The part where you admit you didn't think I'd have the nerve, that you wanted me out of the way." Diego didn't answer. Fear didn't show on his face, but it did in his shoulders, in the way his arms fell, like someone realizing for the first time that they'd lost. Lucia walked out of the auditorium. A security guard tried to stop her. An Aeronova assistant asked if she wanted to speak to the press. She ignored them both. In the parking lot, she leaned against the wall and breathed. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was just the weight starting to lift. She knew the hard part was still ahead, exposing the proof, dealing with the public reaction, facing the system again. But now she wasn't alone, because she had a voice, and people willing to listen. And on the other side of town, in her small workshop, there was a box with more evidence, more records, more fragments of a story they tried to erase. Everything was ready. The truth no longer needed permission. The first notification arrived before her coffee. "Are you the woman from the engine?" Someone at Aeronova had posted the video of her presentation to their personal profile. In less than 8 hours, it was trending nationwide. Comments were split between astonishment, admiration, and outrage. How did a workshop technician do what engineers couldn't? This woman needs to be heard. And who is this Diego guy anyway? The company tried to contain the damage, but it was already too late. The truth was ablaze. That afternoon, Lucia was invited back to Aeronova under a different protocol, not as a candidate, but as a technical whistleblower. The conference room was smaller than the auditorium, but heavier with tension. Directors, chief engineers, 2 company lawyers, and seated in the back, a handful of journalists under orders not to broadcast live. Lucia walked in with the same screwdriver in her pocket and a drive in her hand. When she plugged it into the display panel, a timeline appeared. Dates, prototypes, failures, logs signed by both her and Diego, dated before her forced dismissal. She pointed out exactly where the mistakes were, explained how they had been covered up, showed the recurring fault that almost caused a thermal collapse during full-thrust tests. Then she hit play on an audio clip. Her conversation with Diego. "You're not going to get anything from this. You showed up. Don't ruin it." The room froze. The technical director tried to speak. The lawyer asked for a moment to pause, but Lucia had already said what mattered. "I didn't come here seeking justice for myself. I came to prevent someone else from being erased like I was. The difference now is I have proof, and I have a voice." "And what do you want exactly?" one of the lawyers asked. Lucia took a breath. "That this works, without killing anyone. Is that all?" She nodded. "Technology doesn't have an owner. It has creators. It has consequences, and sometimes it has survivors. I came here to fix more than an engine. I came to fix the truth." Silence. One of the older engineers stood up, held out his hand. "I'm sorry." She shook it without hesitation, but she didn't smile, because forgiveness here wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Behind her, the silence was thick. Then something unexpected. One of the younger engineers, who had once looked at her with contempt, began to clap, slowly, as if he finally understood. Others joined in. A janitor leaning against the back wall filmed with teary eyes. No one spoke, but in that simple gesture was what the system had always tried to avoid: respect without hierarchy. The next morning, Aeronova issued an official statement. They acknowledged inconsistencies in the project, announced an internal investigation, and suspended the MX-900 from further testing until further notice. Diego Ferraz released at his own request. But that was a detail. What really went viral was the speech of the woman without a degree. Lucia's address cut through every bubble. It reached college forums, engineering pages, peripheral communities, people who'd never had a voice but saw themselves in her. And in one of the most liked comments, someone wrote, "She didn't win, but she gave us back our right to try." The lights, the interviews, the invitations, she turned them all down, not out of disdain, but because she already knew what mattered. 2 days after the Aeronova scandal, Lucia returned to the Santa Clara workshop. She opened the iron gate at 7 in the morning, as she always had. The floor was dusty, the whiteboard half erased, and the smell of oil felt like an old embrace. And there they were, her students, a group of 5, 3 boys, 2 girls, all between 15 and 18. They looked at her as though seeing, for the first time, not just a teacher, but a survivor. "Teacher, all that, and was it true?" She nodded, without fanfare. One of the boys, who usually doubted his ability to tighten a screw correctly, spoke with wide eyes. "Ms. Lucia, you were like the mind behind the country's most advanced engine." She smiled. "And I'm still the mind behind this workshop." They laughed. But there was something different now. Respect without fear. Admiration without idolization. Real inspiration. Lucia grabbed a piece of craft paper, taped it to the whiteboard, wrote with a thick marker, "We don't need to prove anything. We just need to remember who we are." And below that, "The shop belongs to everyone. So does the truth." That afternoon, she taught them about torque adjustments, about the errors that don't show up in diagnostics, about listening to an engine with your ear, not just software. At the end, one of the girls, shy, thin, who never asked questions, raised her hand. "Teacher, if you were betrayed by someone so close, How do you trust people again? Lucia paused for a second, looked at the workbench, at the attentive eyes in front of her, at the space where she'd rebuilt her life from rejected pieces. Then she said, I don't trust titles or badges. I trust processes, time, and people who show up when they have nothing to gain. The girl nodded, but another question remained. And why didn't you become famous? Why didn't you accept the prize? Lucia looked out the window. The afternoon sun shone on the iron gate. Outside, a neighborhood boy flew a kite made of old newspaper. She answered without taking her eyes off the scene, because my legacy isn't being recognized. It's making sure none of you ever have to be erased to be heard. Silence, heavy and light at the same time. The following week, the workshop gained more students, more donated parts, more curious eyes, and on one of the walls someone painted with a brush, "Here we build more than engines, here we fix the world." Lucia didn't correct it, didn't erase it. She simply smiled, small, discreet, but true. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't climbing onto the podium, it's lighting a path for those who never had a track. And when truth finds a shelter, not even silence can erase its voice. Comment I saw if you've ever been underestimated just because you seemed invisible. And if this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe, because that's how more voices like hers find a place.